have two speakers for you this evening. Many of you will already know Professor Peter Edge from the School of Law at Oxford Brookes University. Peter spent many years researching Manx legal and constitutional issues, and he's lectured on the island on numerous occasions already. Professor Claire de Tan is Director of Studies at the Institute of Law at Jersey and a Jersey Law Commissioner. She also lectures in law at University of London. And she spent many years researching the laws of the Crown Dependencies and the British Overseas Territories. And I think it will be very interesting to get her perspective on the recent constitutional developments on the Isle of Man. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be talking about the Manx Constitution, and thank you very much for coming along on a fairly grim January evening. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Lisvane period, the Lisvane review, look at what I think are the three most significant areas, the legacy in Lisvane. I'm then going to conclude my section with a couple of concluding thoughts on about constitutional change, and then I'm going to turn over to Claire, who is going to give us a Channel Islands take on some of the issues that the Isle of Man has been wrestling with. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. So, I suggested this a thing called a Lisvane period. So, a period of constitutional reflection and change in the Isle of Man, characterised by the Lisvane review and then adoption or rejection and discussion of what Lisvane thought about. Tension between the House of Keys and the Legislative Council, in particular, and also between Tynwald and government, is a perennial feature of the Manx Constitution. I could give you examples going back to the 17th, 18th, 19th century about this particular tension. The 20th century is really categorised entirely by tension between Legco and the House of Keys. In the 21st century, there was frustration over, to quote Mr. Bell, the exasperation year after year, interminable debates on reforming Legco. As a result of this frustration, the Lisvane review was commissioned, and it had a very broad brief indeed, as it finally took the shape, of examining the functioning of the branches of Tynwald, assessing their efficacy, consider the scrutiny structure, and make recommendations for reform if necessary. So, Lord Lisvane, who had had an extremely long and successful career within the parliamentary system at Westminster, had a very broad brief in his review. He carried out his review in 2016. It was discussed in Tynwald in 2017 and 2018, and at the end of the 2018 debates, there was a recognition that constitutional debate was no longer framed by Lisvane. So we've reached the end of the Lisvane period in 2018. I think that there are three significant areas where the legacy of Lisvane is worth talking about. The first one is membership of the Legislative Council. Now, during the 20th century, Legco had moved from a body composed of Crown officers, so composed of officials who were appointed by the English Crown to run the Isle of Man, the Attorney General, the various ecclesiastical officers, the Deemsters, the Governor, to one that was dominated by appointees of the House of Keys. So we moved from a position where everybody on Legco was appointed by the Crown, to the modern position where there's the President of Tynwald, who doesn't normally vote, the Attorney General, who can never vote, the Lord Bishop of Soda, or a man who can and enthusiastically does vote, and a number of members of the Legislative Council who are appointed by MHKs for a fixed term. So this is quite an unusual thing about the Manx Constitution. The upper chamber is overwhelmingly appointed by the lower chamber. You look across the world, it's a really unusual pattern. In 2015, which some people will recall, the appointment process was seen as particularly troublesome. It took 17 ballots spread over 2 days of business to fill the vacancies. And this was seen as this is something that's broken here, this is not the way it should be working out. And as well as the amount of time it took to fill the MLC vacancies, there was concern that the field was too limited. And in particular, there was a concern that MHKs were moving into the Legislative Council as sort of part of a final phase of a political career. And that there was not enough effort being made to bring candidates in from outside the House of Keys. So this is one of the things Lisvane looked at. He recommended an independent nominations commission, a body whose job would be to present the Keys with a list of possible candidates. They would consider nominations from the public, from MHKs, from MLCs or would-be MLCs, so people could nominate themselves, but no sitting MHK could be nominated. So Lisvane actually proposed a legal ban on MHKs then being appointed to become members of the Legislative Council. The Nominations Commission would recommend candidates in order of merit, and a single round of voting would fill the available places by order of votes obtained. Interestingly, Lisvane had no changes to recommend for the position of the Lord Bishop, and he recommended the Lord Bishop should remain a voting member of Council, which, bearing in mind how contentious the seat of the Lord Bishop had been in the past, was, I think, quite interesting in itself. So this is what Lisvane recommended, this is what Tynwald decided. No Nominations Commission, the Nomination Commission went out quickly. Sitting MHKs would remain legally eligible to be appointed, but the process would change so it would be completed in a single day. A number of important changes there. Nominations would be in advance and had to be in advance. Initially proposed the Speaker, but actually landed on the President, would have a duty to ensure that candidates could meet MHKs, and votes by a majority of MHKs, with the least successful candidate dropping out each time until all places were filled. It was initially proposed that this appointment process should be by secret ballot, and certainly had been in the past. But there was considerable concern when this was put forward by the Select Committee, and actually the Keys unanimously decided that it would be an open ballot. So you would get to see who your MHK voted for to become an MLC. And Tynwald also, after quite a protracted process, decided there would be no change to the position of the Lord Bishop. So, Lisvane proposes some fairly big changes, less changes adopted by Tynwald, but still some important changes. And we'll see the implications of those in a moment. Another legacy, I think, is the powers of the Legislative Council. Before 1961, Council could veto legislation. Every act of Tynwald required assent by both the Keys and by the Council. After 1961, the Keys could generally override a veto with a special majority repeated attempts. But the Council always had a chance to exceed first. So basically, the Council always knew that it was about to be overridden by the Keys. So it could choose to accept whatever the Keys said, rather than have that formal power used on it. As a result, the formal power was only exercised once in the Licensing Sunday Opening Act 1979, where a number of members of the Council basically said, we are so conscientiously opposed to increasing drinking time on Sundays, Methodism was quite a big strand at that point, that we are going to signify our objection to this change, even though it then means that the Keys gets to override us. In 2006, the process was simplified, which allowed a motion by the Keys to override with a special majority, the Council not having a chance to look at it again. Okay? So the big difference was pre-2006, the Council was the final actor. They could choose to go along with the Keys or be overridden. Post-2006, the Keys is the final actor. They choose to trigger the override, and it happens. Members of the Council could take governmental roles, typically as departmental members, and members of Council voted in the appointment of the Chief Minister. In 2016, the vote was for the first time taken by the Keys first, then the Council, knowing how the Keys had voted. In 2016, no MHK had a majority in the Keys, but the Council voted unanimously to support the member with the most MHK votes as Chief Minister. So that's quite distinctive. You know, you don't normally have the second chamber being involved in appointing the minister, the head of the executive of a country. Lisvane had some very clear recommendations on this. He recommended that members of council should not normally be part of government, the members of council should not vote on the appointment of the chief minister, and that fewer members of Tynwald should be in government. In particular, he rejected entirely the idea of the departmental member. So he wanted to see far fewer members of Tynwald who were in any way part of the government, and he didn't want anyone in Legco to be part of the government. Tynwald decided no change of departmental members' role or eligibility of members of the Legislative Council to join government. So that significant bit of Lisvane was rejected. Lisvane recommended that MLCs should not be able to vote on the appointment of the Chief Minister. Now, before Lisvane reported, a bill had been passed by the Keys which would have affected that. So they said actually the Council should not vote in the appointment of the Chief Minister. It had been rejected in the Legislative Council, so it had failed the members of the Council. and the Keys used its new override power for the first and so far only time to pass the legislation in any case. What I think is interesting, apart from reducing the power and significance of the Legislative Council, is that when this was being discussed, it was dissociated from Lisvane. So even though it was exactly what Lisvane recommended, the proposer said, this is an Isle of Man initiative initiated by a proud Manxman inside the House of Keys at the beginning of 2016. Third legacy, gender diversity. Lisvane was concerned at the homogeneity of Tynwald. Average age 57.8, which I fear is looking increasingly sensible to me as the years go on, but it's pretty high. Female membership below 6%, which if Tynwald had been entered into the Interparliamentary Union's league table, would have put us at 178th place in the world's legislatures. This wasn't great, and there was a recognition that this really wasn't great. Interestingly, Lisvane had no concrete solution. He identified the illness, but he did not have any cure. He did say it was an issue of such importance that both Tynwald and civil society need to address it with energy, but he didn't say how that energy should be directed or where it should go. Tynwald did not do very much specific. There was consensus that there was a concern, but there was no real consideration of mechanisms used elsewhere to increase female representation, and that's for a very particular reason, which I'll come to in a moment. But other people decided. Candidates decided, and so did the people who get to elect candidates. I think these figures are really, really interesting. Pre-Lisvane, so the last MHK election before Lisvane, just over 10% female candidates, just over 8% of those elected were female. If one decision had gone 49 votes differently, it would have been more than 10.9%. Okay? So basically we're looking at only 10% of candidates are female. They get appointed in the same numbers as male candidates. So the issue isn't that women are running and not being elected, it's that a relatively small number of women are running for MHKs. The first post-Lisvane election, double the number of female candidates, double the number of MHKs, because it's the candidature is the clock, not the election. It's even more pointed in the Legislative Council. The last election for the Legislative Council before Lisvane, no female candidates were put forward. Obviously, no women were elected. First post-Lisvane MLC election, 60% female candidates. Everyone who joined the Legislative Council that time around was female. Really significant changes. So I've given some of the sort of the narrative, the big things that happened from Lisvane and the way the legacy you could expect from that. I'm going to conclude with two thoughts inspired by that, really. One of the ideas is the idea of managing intimacy, which is the idea that in a small state, people keep interacting with each other in lots of different ways. Okay? I vote for my MP in Westminster, who for my pains until about 7 years ago was Boris Johnson. I didn't vote for my MP in Westminster. But fundamentally, my only real interaction with them is as my MP. If you think about your MHK, there are a whole nexus of different ways you can interact with them. You probably know where they live. You may have your children go to the same school as their children go to. You may share the same pharmacy. You may share the same GP. You may find yourselves involved with them in different levels when things come up for planning disputes, etc. And this is something which is not unique to the Isle of Man. Bray in 1991 wrote, in contrast to medium-sized and large states, everybody seems to know everybody else and does so in a wide range of different contexts. This means it actually can be quite difficult to be dispassionate, to make it clear there's no connections with anyone who you're making a decision over, to make the very hard decisions. The demise of the secret ballot for the Legislative Council reinforces the importance of a democratic mandate to Manx political legitimacy. Very strong theme in that debate was, we as MHKs are here because we've been voted for by people. MLCs are not being voted for by people, but at the very least, Manx electors need to know how we voted. Yeah? So it should not be a secret, we should be held accountable for our decision to put in the council. But there was a very interesting contribution by Mr. Malarkey. Now, Mr. Malarkey was the only voice raised against open ballots. He actually voted for open ballots at the end. It was a unanimous vote. He said, I think the new members have to experience a round or two in here to find out just how difficult it is at times to pick who you're putting into a job on the same pay scale as you, basically for the next 5 years. One of them might be your next door neighbour, one might be your brother-in-law. With a public vote, you're not going to get much out of your brother-in-law or your next door neighbour for the next 5 years. In some cases, the suggestion was that wouldn't be a terribly bad thing, because he has found out you have not voted for him and you have voted for the best person you consider for the job. I think that sometimes you can get stuck in a situation. Remember, we're a small island. We all know each other, and once you start bringing people in, that isn't my ... that's Mr. Malarkey's ... Okay? He tails off at that point of the debate. Now, one response is to see this as part of normal political life and effectively say, you know, you ran for office, this is what office carries with it, you know, pull yourself together. And actually, in the same debate, that was the response that Mr. Malarkey largely got. Ms. Pedersen, for instance, said that MHKs and MLCs will be more than able to conduct themselves in a political manner. So the fact that somebody knows you didn't vote for them to become MLC is not going to damage the relationship later on. So one response to the problem of managing intimacy is to say, well look, it's just one of those things, you know, if you're a politician in the Isle of Man, you're going to have to be prepared to the fact that your neighbour will lean over your back garden occasionally and give you grief for the way you voted on the previous Tuesday. Another is to see it as a special problem in small democracies the constitutional design needs to engage with. That democracy in small states may have particular peculiar characteristics. Now, Corbett and Veenendaal have done a really good recent study of small democracies across the world. And they know that the sheer size of electorates in larger states means that political office holders simply do not have the time and the resources to communicate directly with all their constituents. By contrast, small states are able to overcome these limitations, albeit with varying effects. There is no dominant party political system in the Isle of Man. Okay? If the Isle of Man had constituencies the size of England and Wales, I predict that you would have a party political system, because there would be no personal connection which would allow you to gauge possible candidates for MHK. You would be using party political affiliation as a shortcut, as a way of making your decisions. So that's a consequence of smallness. What I'm also suggesting is that maybe we need to think about this problem of managing intimacy when looking at constitutional design. And one way to look at the Nominations Commission, although I'm pretty sure Lisvane wasn't thinking of it in quite this way, it's a way of managing intimacy. You have this body which has made the decision about the shortlist, and the fact that your dentist is not on the shortlist is not held against a particular MHK. Okay? It is a collective decision by a body which Lisvane recommended suggests one outsider, and then the MHKs vote in open ballot and are held democratically accountable for their choice within that. The Nomination Commission has strengths and weaknesses. I think thinking about it in terms of managing intimacy might be useful to understand it. My second thought is that recent developments in the Isle of Man have concentrated power. The shift of power from council to keys, which we can trace all the way back to 1911, has given more power, has shifted the balance, has given more power to 24 members of the House of Keys. Sutton has said that a particular concern for small democracies is it is relatively easy for a determined, unscrupulous individual to dominate all or most aspects of the country's life. Looking at Loch Promenade this afternoon, I thought, yeah, that has been true in the past. Okay? The high imperial lieutenant governors of the Isle of Man had all of the strings. They either directly had the power or they had the influence to do pretty much whatever they thought was appropriate. I don't think that's true of the modern Isle of Man. I am to be corrected during the question and answers, but I don't think any one individual is so powerful. More realistically, however, constitutional authority is now concentrated in 24 MHKs. They can override council in relation to legislation. They are the sole people who appoint the Chief Minister, and therefore can remove the Chief Minister. They are the people who appoint the MLCs themselves. So there's a lot of power in those 24 MHKs. Is that too concentrated? There is a really interesting study by Johnson and McLean in 2012. They looked at 22 small democracies, which they took to be between 50,000 and 150,000. So quite neatly encompasses the Isle of Man and Guernsey and Jersey, which we're going to be talking about a little later. And one of the things they looked at was the electors per elected representatives. So how many people capable of voting do you have compared to the number of people voted in? Okay? Guernsey, top the table, 1,328 people for every person in their legislature, every elected person in the legislature. Jersey was close at 1920, hitting number 5. The Isle of Man was at 3,521, which is number 13. I was a bit surprised by this. One of the reasons I went looking for this information was somebody said, oh, bloody hell, we've got too many as it is. You know, what do you mean it's too concentrated? We've got far too many to go anywhere else. And the answer is you haven't, actually. 24 MHKs for our population for a small democracy is not on the high side. I have a tendency to look at things from a legal history perspective, which means I will casually refer to recent developments, meaning anything since about 1840. So only from a legal history perspective, really, could my next sentence make any sense. If we returned the keys to its old size of 32, which does admittedly involve annexing the Shetlands, or at least be prepared to, invade is such a strong word, annex is so much uglier. If the keys returned to its old size of 32, it would move to 2,640 electors per representative, and it would be number 8 in the league table, below Guernsey, below Jersey, but much more within reach. There are a number of practical responses to talking about having more MHKs. The one I've got most often from people is how do you pay for it? Where is that resourced? Things like that. So, a couple of thoughts at the end of the reflection on the very macro of Lisvane. What I'm now going to do is turn over to my colleague, who will give you a view from the Channel Islands on some of these key issues.
Now, I'm quite known for overrunning, and given that I'm talking about all the Channel Islands, an extreme close-up, and from the year 1204 onwards, there is a danger there. So this is going to be an extreme close-up. If you want more details on anything, just ask me later. Yeah? So, reflections from some of the Channel Islands on some of the points at great speed. Because you don't want to be here for a couple of weeks, no? Okay, so 800 years in a couple of minutes, no trouble. Channel Islands are larger and smaller than the Isle of Man. This feels like a very, very large Guernsey when you come here. So Jersey is 25% larger in terms of population than the Isle of Man. Guernsey is 25% smaller. But we're talking with, relatively small numbers. Much as we all love to emphasise our differences as crown dependencies, and particularly the Channel Islands love to pretend to hate each other, the islands have many similarities with the Isle of Man, and indeed with some of the British Overseas Territories, which are islands as well. There is so much of the shared history, constitutional history, and the relationship with the UK, which is similar. And every small jurisdiction has the same challenge. How do you manage having all the same functions and all the same laws that you would need somewhere much bigger, much more complicated, and with an awful lot more money? But you end up with quite simplistic comparisons when you're trying to look for differences in the history of the Crown dependencies, and when you're trying to compare the Channel Islands to the Isle of Man. You end up saying things like, well, the Isle of Man has more online gambling, and Jersey has more potatoes, and Guernsey has more tomatoes. That's the sort of difference we're looking at. Actually, when you look at what's happened in terms of constitutional reform of the different jurisdictions, they borrow from each other all the time. One of the major reforms in Jersey was not cut and pasted, but heavily inspired by the Isle of Man. So we treat each other as test labs, often. and often successfully. But we've also got the opportunity to learn from each other's unsuccesses. I won't call them mistakes because that would be a bad thing. Okay, so the biggest difference with the lawmaking bodies of Jersey and Guernsey is their structure. They're both unicameral, so only one body, only one chamber. And in theory, this should make things cheaper and quicker, and sometimes it does. In theory, it should produce more unanimity, and in theory, it should have disadvantages, including checks and balances and scrutiny. Jersey and Guernsey, in slightly different ways, have for each of their states, each of their assemblies of politicians, have found ways of having their own checks and balances, which are way beyond the scope of the time I have today, but we'll write something about it later. But we've had parallel, in the Channel Islands, in the two largest ones, the ones which pretend to be rivals, we've had our own reviews of government and governance, which have remarkable parallels to the reviews here, and the response has been the same. Someone has been commissioned to write a very detailed report. Then the detail of the report has been implemented, but not the headlines, not the big changes. We all at the moment in the 21st century have the same big drivers in our future as the Crown dependencies. And most of the challenges facing the Isle of Man, politically or legally now, are common to all small states. So what I urge people to do is to think across the small states, even within the British territories, and learn from each other's experience, because that happens so rarely in practice. You've ended up with 14 different small states within the British umbrella responding to Brexit and what their challenges will be. Well, a lot of the challenges will be the same, because they're not challenges of our making. You've got many different British territories spending time, effort, money, bringing in international experts on what to do to avoid being on financial blacklists, for example. It's one financial blacklist they're talking about. The same experts are doing the talking. It could all have been dealt with together. And I'm not talking about an international federation of British states or anything, but just, some workshops, some pooling of resources. So we don't have time for the detail on the history, but for very obvious reasons, the main drivers in the history of development of the Constitution in the states of Jersey and State of Guernsey have been shared with the Isle of Man. It's about working out your place in the world compared to the UK. We've had many of the same battles. So, using Jersey as an example first, we had a report which was like Lisvane in 2000. It's the Clothier Review, and it recommended a sweeping set of major reforms, and they've been partially implemented. One of the things I write about as an academic and a law commissioner is the dangers of partial law reform. So if you commission someone to do a particular task and then cherry pick which of the results they've come up with and which of the recommendations they've come up with, I write about what the dangers are. Sometimes it works brilliantly, because it just does. Bermuda, for example, has a criminal law code which is cut and pasted from 3 other countries and has never entirely existed in any of those countries. But they cut and pasted the right bits, and it works. And they ended up with some laws which work brilliantly for them. And the bits which didn't work brilliantly, they've adapted. Judges have interpreted. So it's possible when it's deliberate. What happened with the Clothier Review is that parts of the package were implemented, but not necessarily with the other parts which would have made them work. We did borrow from the Isle of Man the idea of ministerial government and scrutiny committees. And those were definitely improvements, so that was positive cut and pasting and partial reform. But some of the things which weren't implemented are huge constitutional battles, and they're very personal for people in small island states, and they might sound familiar. Now, I don't have time for detail now. Again, you'll be able to read a paper at some point in the future, or you can email me. Abolishing long-held roles, or changing their status, removing people from a parliament who have been elected to be there, changing the role of religion in a parliament, whether a religious post holder gets a vote in a parliament. These are all themes in the Clothier Review in Jersey in 2000, and they cause tension and, let's call it, debate. And human rights cases. So here are some of our key constitutional debates in the Channel Islands. Do they look familiar? Yeah? So we end up with, Jersey's had a lot of debate recently about silos in government, government with a big G. So silos in how the state bureaucracy is managed, in trying to work towards changing that. But I think sometimes small states act like silos. They act as if they are entirely separate, and there's no need to do that. There's so much shared battle. So, gender diversity. The figures for Jersey and Guernsey look pretty good when it comes to membership of the elected parliaments, because they are, on the last set of figures, topping the league. But there have been surveys, government commission surveys, very recently, which have shown that the population don't feel represented. So there may only be 2,000 people in a constituency, or the equivalent of a constituency, but a lot of them won't bother to vote because they don't feel enfranchised. They don't feel that they've got the right candidates in front of them. Sometimes this is because there are uncontested seats. So there's only one candidate running. Why vote? If there's one candidate, why show up? What I would like to see is a mechanism which deals with uncontested seats. Other countries have managed it. There are lots of examples we can learn from in the world. And that could mean that we do get proof to show to the population that their voices will be heard, that they are represented by their elected representatives. Campaigns are underway to change this. Is a proposition at the moment, so a proposal to be debated in the States of Jersey, which has been put forward for a gender diversity role to be taken on. And that's happened before. It could work. In Guernsey, there have been some initiatives which have really worked. There's been a training programme for potential female candidates, for example, which made so much difference that a complaint was lodged by potential male candidates that their chances had dwindled of being elected. So it must have been successful. And in the last Guernsey election, you had about 73% of people voting, which is, nearly double what Jersey does, double what most democracies manage. There are lessons to be learned from some of the other small island states within the British umbrella, where we could simply say, they tried this, it didn't cost them very much money. It can be cascaded, rather than having an expert come in and tell you something and then go away with their skills. The skills can be transferred to and embedded in local processes, so that everybody knows how to encourage a more diverse set of candidates to run for political office, how to support people with the common challenges. Now, you've succeeded in one of your representative bodies, but the other one, the figures could go up a bit, because they're a bit like Jersey, yeah? So, two islands, really close to each other, with an extremely shared history, have ended up with radically different levels, radically different figures on voting and on gender diversity in election in 2 years, because somebody tried something. So we have a lot of shared causes. We could share solutions. One of the debates at the moment is how many of the representatives in the Parliament in the Channel Islands should be elected by local constituents, so should have a tie to their parish, to their local area, and how many should be island-wide. And you've got, developing very fast in the Channel Islands, you've got absolute opposites, very local and completely island-wide. So it's a test lab. And the Isle of Man can sit back, and the rest of the world can sit back and wait a few years, see if it goes horribly wrong, and then learn from the experience. The role of religion I mentioned, whether people who have a religious post represent the whole of an island, whether they are perceived as representing the whole of an island, how they can ensure that they are, and whether they should have a voice, a vote, or both in democracy. So in Jersey we have a religious post holder who can speak but can't vote, which is one of those, if everyone's unhappy, compromises, you know. But I think the challenge which all of us are facing, Crown dependencies, overseas territories, small states across the world, are how to keep the positively unique features in our political and legal systems, how to defend the things we cherish. Well, we've got to fight really big 21st century battles like international money laundering, anti-terrorism laws, the growth of the global legal order, and the fast evolving relationships with Europe and the UK. Even the UK is struggling to manage keeping what's unique against the global tide of change. They have slightly more resources at their beck and call. So picking up on something that Peter said, concentrating power. We've got quotes here. I'm not going to go through them in detail because I'd like other people to speak to. It looks on the surface in the Channel Islands as if the figures are better than in the Isle of Man, or indeed almost any other small democracy, for people power. In other words, the possibility of your vote making a change. It looks that way. But a survey done in Jersey in November shows that voters don't believe, people particularly who don't vote, don't believe that their vote would make a change. And that's one of the main reasons why they don't vote. Now that research could easily be repeated in lots of other places, or learned from in lots of other places. I can talk about it because I wasn't involved in it. But those are the three big issues which people raise time and again in voter studies in small states. People don't vote, or they don't bother to register to vote, if they don't think that they will be represented in the outcome of the election. They don't think that their representatives will be responsive to the issues which matter to them personally, my life, and if they don't think that representatives resemble them. Now, if there's only one candidate and they don't resemble you, I can see why people don't vote. But it's so easy to get voting figures up with a bit of tweaking. Some small states have managed it. Now, another thinking point for you is, this is from a report from Jersey which could have been written in lots of different small democracies. And it's about, from the Clothier report in 2000, it's about observations of the behaviour of some elected members of the Parliament. So, Clothier report says that there's a huge range of behaviours amongst elected politicians in Jersey. Some will speak on every topic, regardless of whether they know anything about it, and others are silent. Sometimes there are long debates on trivial issues and sometimes almost no debate. Some people make long speeches, long pretty speeches, and I've called this Groundhog Day because it wasn't his term, but it feels like you're in an endless loop sometimes. The same issues keep being debated but nothing happens, and sometimes you reverse your view from what you said last month. Some of this is because of the lack of party politics, or the lack of pervasive party politics in the states I'm talking about. Jersey, you've got one political party and then everybody else. It has 5 members and then there are another 44 elected members. So you get some party political things happening and some very personal voting happening. Guernsey doesn't have any official political parties, but it has 2 things which look like political parties. And it may have lots after it's finished its major constitutional reform that it's doing at the moment. So it can feel quite unpredictable in the Channel Islands as to whether a law will pass, when it will pass, and who will be responsible for getting it through, getting it over the line. The other thing that the Clothier report raises, which is very relevant to our discussion right now, is the development of dynasties in politics. Now, I don't necessarily mean here that families are influential in politics, but there can be a feeling of who should inherit, who should take on the baton in a particular political role. And Clothier views it as a kind of meritocracy, says it's not really that people are destined for office because in small places everyone knows everyone and it's obvious who the candidate should be. It's brilliance that causes some people to rise to the top. Problem. That doesn't necessarily help with diversity, and it can be quite a daunting group of people to consider standing up against or running against when they have a lot of shared experience in education, in background, and in public visibility. So one of the cures which the Clothier report came up for was to borrow scrutiny committees from the Isle of Man, and that definitely has helped in distributing power and shaking things up a bit. But I still think that small jurisdictions in general, not just the Channel Islands, need to keep an eye on what are the barriers to change, what are the assumptions about who should have a role. And just because somebody has been elected to a role and it's going well, it doesn't mean that there isn't another way. Right, so here's my soapbox. How should small jurisdictions reform? If you're interested in this, I'll be giving a couple of conference papers in March about this in other places, and at some point I'll be writing them up. But this is, because I'm a law commissioner, I spend a lot of time trying to reform laws and practices in small jurisdictions. I also work with some bigger ones. Every small jurisdiction I've ever worked with, and I think it's 6 British overseas territories, and I think I've got full house on Crown dependencies one way or another. It's pretty good for bingo. Not so great financially for an academic because you don't charge consultancy fees. Every single one I've worked with has said the first thing that they've told me in the brief when I've been asked to help them with a law reform issue or sometimes a political reform issue is, we're different, we're special, we're distinctive. There are some things that mustn't change. And I say, great, but you're asking me in for reform. So when you say it mustn't change, do you mean it mustn't change at all? Or do you mean there are some things that if I recommend, it's never going to happen? Because I don't want to waste everyone's time. And anyone who's ever done any law drafting knows there are ways of making it look like non-change. Put in a preamble. There we go. But, as I said earlier, small jurisdictions need just as much law as everybody else. And they have to meet changes in society, changes in the world, just as much as big places. So there is a real danger of small jurisdictions falling behind the times in legal developments unless they work cleverly together. Now, one thing that almost certainly happens here, looking for reassurance to Peter, is that you end up with voids in the law, where you don't know what the law is, because nobody's raised it yet, and if a judge had to deal with it, or if somebody asked your elected body, what's the law, and they said, don't know, they'd probably make one. It might take a while. The tendency in small jurisdictions, particularly the small British jurisdictions, is to look around desperately for an existing local and distinctive solution, and if that doesn't exist, to lurch to the other extreme and find one that someone else made earlier. So the cut and paste model is very, very common. Now, comparative lawyers think that's very dangerous, but I'm an unorthodox comparative lawyer, so I'm going to say that sometimes it works first. There's a famous quote that I put onto the slide there in comparative law: only a fool would refuse quinine just because it doesn't grow in his own garden. So being inspired by other jurisdictions can be healthy. If you want to survive malaria and there's a cure, you take the cure. But one of the things that doesn't always happen in small jurisdictions, because they're time poor and resource poor, and they don't necessarily have bodies whose job it is to find the perfect cure, to problem solve everything. What doesn't happen is the checking. So, if you think you've got malaria and someone else has got quinine, firstly, check you've got malaria. So check you have the same problem as them before you cut and paste their solution. Then if you're going to buy the solution, buy the cure from them, or borrow, by creative drafting that looks the same as theirs, which all small jurisdictions have done at some point, then you need to make sure that you borrow it in a way that works for your jurisdiction. And very often it doesn't. And I've had some surreal experiences with law reform in small jurisdictions, where the wording of a written law is impossible for the country which has implemented it, because it's got words taken from, often England and Wales, occasionally Scotland, which refer to concepts that don't exist in the country that's borrowing them. So you've got to refer an appeal to a person who doesn't exist and has never existed, or a reference to a crime which is completely different, or a defence that doesn't exist. And my favourite one recently, written reports in broadcasting. The point of broadcasting is that it's not written. But if you copy, it's spoken or performed, yeah? Draft law came out with reference to banning written reports in broadcasting. Well, unless it's one of those YouTube videos where someone's holding up cards with a story written on it, and you're supposed to just read them like a book, there aren't any written reports in broadcasting. But a government had spent time drafting this, people had been paid, they then debated it, about to pass the thing. Yeah? Cut and pasting. So, diagnose the disease, check it's the same as another country. Find the cure in another country. Make sure it works with local conditions. But then, embed the cure. Don't keep going back to the same place and having to ask for help from another jurisdiction, because you end up with partial cut and paste. One of my recommendations as Law Commissioner in Jersey was to radically reform the law of criminal appeals, because it was a snapshot from an English law from 1907, which was long ago abolished in England and Wales because it didn't work, but lingered on in Jersey. And just because it wasn't used very often, because there weren't very many criminal appeals, didn't mean it was a good idea to keep something which had been reformed multiple times in its original jurisdiction. You get this inertia of, we changed that, fixed it, job done, in some small jurisdictions. By working together, we can stop that, because there's always another small jurisdiction, often one of the Crown dependencies, or British Overseas Territories, which has done it differently, and who actually, when you drill down, have very similar laws because of the way that judges developed law in all the British territories in the 19th and early 20th centuries. You get the same concept, and 19th century cut and pasting was rife amongst legislators and law reformers. You get the same concepts popping up in 12 or 13 different countries who all think they have unique problems, who all think that they are struggling to find the resources to deal with those unique problems. Now, what I think would really work for the Crown dependencies is if they had either a law commission each, currently only Jersey has one, so a body whose job it is to look for anachronisms, bits of law that don't work, things which have lurking danger with human rights law, that sort of stuff. To plan for the future, to tidy things up, but retain the distinctiveness. You can write it into their mission statement that they retain what is distinctive and preserve existing laws and existing practices whenever possible. You can have one. It doesn't cost very much because you can persuade academics to do it largely for free. And you just pay them something when they spend 6 months of their life writing a criminal code, or in my case, probably 5 years. Or you can use the resources which other British jurisdictions have developed to do exactly this thing. We can all work together. There's an annual meeting of the law commissions, the British law commissions, where we share practice. It's not hugely expensive to do that. You can use technology. It's the 21st century. We don't even have to be in a room drinking coffee. The budget, you know. But there are so many. Every time I travel to a new small state, I'm told that I'm going to be hearing some different things, and a lot of it is remarkably familiar. So that's what I would like to do, is to cut down, because all small states bring in experts. Some research proposals that I've just reviewed for a funding council in the UK were on flying police officers. How police officers from the UK get flown around the world to give expert talks on policing in 50 different countries. Fascinating stuff. But they fly every few years and do an update. They're not transferring the skills. There's no database of the skills. And no one has checked in those countries they're flying to whether the skills actually exist locally. So, my takeaway points would be, if the Crown dependencies talk to each other more about politics and law reform, they would find that a lot of the work that they're all dealing with and a lot of the challenges they're all facing have already been done earlier. There may be a solution which would work, and the more laws have consistency where they need to be consistent, the more you can preserve the distinctiveness. But also, none of the Crown dependency seems to have a database of its locally resident experts on anything. And every time I advertise, because I write a newspaper column, every time I advertise for help on something, I find, did you know there's the world's leading expert on that? It lives 3 streets away from me. I needed an expert on Greek family law in the 1970s, and there was one resident in Jersey, a retired professor of it, who volunteered her time. We don't know what we've got, because we don't write it down and share it. So, that was me.